Good morning from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. My name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of Spaceflight Now. And welcome to our live coverage of the launch of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket on the Starlink 5-3 mission. This mission is set to deploy 53 more Starlink internet satellites into SpaceX's global broadband network and liftoff from Launch Complex 39A here at Kennedy Space Center is scheduled for 2:58 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 7:58 a.m. UTC. Right before we came on the air with our broadcast, we did receive an update from SpaceX on the launch time, which had been set for 2:43 a.m. Eastern Time. Liftoff now has been pushed back by 15 minutes and is scheduled now for 2:58 a.m. Eastern Time, 7:58 a.m. UTC. You're looking at a live view of Launch Complex 39A from our position about 3 miles from the launch complex. You can see, if you look closely just a moment ago, one of the security helicopters passed behind the launch pad just offshore. Our camera view is looking to the east from the Kennedy Space Center press site, looking out toward the Atlantic Ocean behind the pad. That helicopter was likely one of the Coast Guard helicopters that is tasked with scanning and surveying the area around the launch site to make sure that any vessels and aircraft are clear of restricted airspace and restricted waters around the launch pad and the flight corridor as this Falcon 9 rocket is set to blast off and head off to the southeast this morning with the 53 Starlink satellites on board. Liftoff time is now 55 minutes away. For those of you who keep track of exact launch times, the exact launch time this morning is targeted for 2:58 a.m. and 20 seconds. That's 7:58:20 UTC. We're going to have live updates throughout the remainder of the countdown, as well as throughout the Falcon 9 rocket's initial climb into orbit. It'll take about just shy of 9 minutes for the Falcon 9 rocket to achieve its preliminary orbit with the 53 Starlink satellites. Then the rocket will be coasting halfway around the world before releasing these 53 spacecraft into orbit about 64 minutes, an hour and 4 minutes after liftoff. That's when the 53 Starlink satellites will actually be deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket, and at that point, SpaceX can declare success on this mission. This will be the 8th launch of the year for SpaceX, their 6th from Florida's Space Coast. They've also launched 2 missions from the West Coast out at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. Most recently, just less than 2 days ago now, on Tuesday, they launched a Falcon 9 rocket with 49 Starlink internet satellites. This mission, adding the 53 Starlink satellites to the network, will bring the total number of Starlink spacecraft that SpaceX has launched to 3,875. That is, by a large measure, by a factor of nearly 10, a larger constellation than any other company. And SpaceX is just getting started with thousands more Starlink satellites planned for launch over the coming years. One of the next big milestones in the countdown this morning will be the start of propellant loading. That's coming at T-minus 35 minutes, about 18 minutes from now. We hope to bring you some live updates from SpaceX Launch Control later in the countdown. SpaceX typically provides a audio feed from the Launch Control Center. And once that is up, we will bring that and patch it into this feed so you can hear the voices directly from Launch Control as the countdown heads toward liftoff at 2:58 a.m. Eastern Time, 7:58 a.m. UTC. If you haven't done so yet, we ask you to please hit the like button on our YouTube stream. That helps us get a larger audience for our coverage this morning. So please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us out a lot. The 53 Starlink satellites are stacked inside the nose cone or payload fairing of the Falcon 9 rocket out at Pad 39A, at the very top of that 229-foot vehicle. In this view of the Falcon 9, the lower 2/3 approximately of the rocket is comprised of the first stage booster. On this mission, the first stage is going for its 5th flight. It's a reusable element of the launch vehicle. The black band that you see about 2/3 of the way up the vehicle is the interstage adapter. That's where the upper stage connects up to the first stage. Inside that adapter is the upper stage engine nozzle. And then the white cylinder above that black interstage, below the payload fairing, that's the second stage. That's where the second stage propellant tanks are located. That's a brand new part of the Falcon 9, the only major part of the Falcon 9 that is not reusable. And then above that is the payload compartment where those 53 Starlink satellites are buttoned up for liftoff this morning in 51 minutes. SpaceX's countdown is now T-minus 50 minutes. The first stage booster on this flight, as I mentioned, is going for its 5th trip to space. It's called Booster 1069 in SpaceX's fleet of reusable rockets. And for this mission, it will target a landing on one of SpaceX's drone ships positioned out northeast of the Bahamas. Again, the Falcon 9 for this mission will be taking a track to the southeast from Cape Canaveral and from Kennedy Space Center. T-minus 41 minutes, 20 seconds, and counting. As you can see in the upper right, we have the countdown clock ticking down to the target launch time of 2:58 and 20 seconds a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7:58:20 UTC. We're about 6 minutes away from when we expect to hear confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control that propellant loading is getting underway. In the next few moments, the SpaceX Launch Director will be polling their team over in Firing Room 4 at the Launch Control Center here at KSC, just across the street from our location. That's where the SpaceX launch team and engineers are gathered this morning. They'll register their readiness, go or no-go, via an electronic poll. And if all stations are go, they'll proceed into propellant loading and the start of the automated launch countdown sequence at T-minus 35 minutes. T-minus 37 minutes and counting. Now 2 minutes away from when we expect propellant loading to begin on the Falcon 9 rocket this morning. And we now are getting some audio from SpaceX Launch Control. We hope you heard that on our stream. The tanks on board the Falcon 9 are now venting for the start of propellant loading. So it looks like the countdown will be proceeding toward that target launch time of 2:58 a.m. Eastern Time. to begin this Starlink 5-3 mission. This mission will
Teams
be
have
carrying...
pulled go, propel, load, and launch. For non-urgent no-go conditions, breathe to C or LD and they'll approve aboarding the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety operation, operator shall call hold on the countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed into the launch abort sequence. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands-off, relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
That was the voice of one of the launch team members in Firing Room 4 here at Kennedy Space Center. The pre-launch readiness poll is complete, and all stations pulled go for propellant loading and launch this morning. That propellant loading is set to begin in 30 seconds. As you can see, there is a bit of patchy ground fog here at Kennedy Space Center this morning. That was in the forecast, but is no threat to launch.
And the launch auto has started.
And we just heard the launch auto has started. So the countdown is now in the control of a ground computer sequencer that is governing all of the countdown events down until the T-minus 60-second mark. At T-minus 1 minute, control of the countdown will be handed over from the ground computer to the Falcon 9's flight computer for the final minute of the countdown. The weather conditions here in Florida are near ideal for a rocket launch this morning. There is some patchy ground fog, as I was talking about a moment ago. You can see some of that fog here in this wide view from our position here at Kennedy Space Center's press site, 3 miles from pad 39A. You can see one of the emergency vehicles on the roadway between the vehicle assembly building area and the launch pad, likely associated with one of the roadblocks at the launch danger area around the pad. You can see the lights from that security vehicle illuminating some of the moisture and fog in the atmosphere this morning. The flagpole, as you can see, the flag is limp. No wind this morning. There's been very little wind throughout the night. The waters in the turn basin are also placid, glass-like waters with no ripples. So wind is not a concern. Cloud cover is not a concern this morning. There is a little bit of fog that could restrict the visibility, but right now we have a clear view of pad 39A, and we hope to bring you spectacular views of this nighttime launch. This will be the 8th launch by SpaceX of 2023 and the 6th of the year from here in Florida. This will be the 71st mission overall that SpaceX has launched that's primarily dedicated to deploying satellites for the Starlink Internet network. And it's the 201st launch of a Falcon 9 rocket and the 211th launch overall by SpaceX's Falcon rocket family. That includes Falcon 9s, Falcon 1s, and Falcon Heavies. T-minus 27 minutes, 20 seconds and counting. We're seeing some of the first signs of vapors emanating from the Falcon 9 rocket and the strongback out at Pad 39A as super cold liquid oxygen begins flowing into the vehicle. Kerosene fuel is also being pumped into the Falcon 9 at this time as well. The kerosene is stored close to room temperature, although the Falcon 9 uses a densified kerosene, which is actually chilled down closer to kerosene's freezing temperature than kerosene and other rockets typically are stored at. The liquid oxygen is, of course, a cryogenic oxidizer chilled to several hundred degrees below zero. That's also a densified propellant. The densification that SpaceX does for the Falcon 9 rocket allows them to actually put more molecules of oxidizer and fuel into the propellant tanks. That gives a increase or improvement to the Falcon 9's lift capability. It also ensures that the first stage booster has enough propellant reserve to perform its maneuvers to return to Earth for landing on the drone ship positioned out near the Bahamas this morning. Right now, 3 of the 4 propellant tanks on the Falcon 9 are being loaded. Both tanks on the first stage are being loaded right now with kerosene and liquid oxygen. And right now, kerosene fuel is being loaded into the upper stage. That will terminate in about 5 minutes or so. At that point, the tank on the upper stage will be full. And then loading of liquid oxygen onto the stage 2 of the Falcon 9 rocket will get underway at about T-minus 16 minutes. This mission will be carrying a batch of 53 Starlink internet satellites into orbit. This is what those satellites look like while they're buttoned up inside the payload fairing of a Falcon 9 rocket. This photo comes from a previous mission. This is a file photo, but it is representative of what the payloads look like while they're in launch configuration. They're flat packed, one on top of the other, held down onto the rocket by 4 metallic retention rods. And those retention rods actually release at the moment of spacecraft deployment in orbit, and that allows the 53 Starlink satellites to fly free of the Falcon 9 rocket and the upper stage of the Falcon 9 rocket at the correct time. And all 53 satellites separated at once. Other spacecraft, other satellites use a ring mechanism or springs to eject from the rocket. Not the case with the Starlink satellites. Once those retention rods are released, the satellites simply naturally separate from the Falcon 9 rocket. T-minus 24 minutes, 20 seconds and counting. See some more of those vapors building up out at Launch Complex 39A. At the very bottom of the Falcon 9 rocket is the kerosene tank. That's where the Rocket Propellant 1 fuel, RP1, which is a highly refined kerosene, is being loaded. Above that is the liquid oxygen tank. That's where we're seeing a lot of the vapors right now as the frost and ice and condensation builds up on the outer skin of that liquid oxygen tank. As we were talking a moment ago, the 53 satellites on board are inside the payload fairing and launch configuration. Each of these satellites weighs about 660 pounds or about 300 kilograms. Once deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket, they'll unfurl solar panels and activate krypton-fueled ion plasma engines. Those will be used for all of the in-orbit maneuvers throughout the lifetime of each spacecraft. SpaceX builds these satellites on an assembly line at their Starlink facility up in Redmond, Washington, near Seattle. And this mission, Starlink 5-3, is the 3rd SpaceX launch into the 2nd generation Starlink network, known as Gen 2. SpaceX began deploying the Gen 2 network for Starlink back on a launch on December the 28th. There was another launch last week from here at the Cape, also targeting Gen 2. And this mission, again, will be the 3rd mission, the 3rd launch to begin or continue populating the 2nd generation Starlink network. The satellites that are on this mission are virtually identical. We don't know of any differences between these satellites and the 1st generation Starlink satellites that SpaceX has been launching over the last couple of years. However, The difference is primarily regulatory. The Federal Communications Commission last month approved SpaceX to launch and operate up to about 7,500 second-generation network satellites. And with that, just within weeks of that approval from the FCC, SpaceX began populating the first orbital plane, the first orbital shell that constitutes the Gen 2 network. For those of you unfamiliar, this is what the Starlink ground user terminal looks like. It's a square rectangular parabolic antenna, phased array antenna rather, that actually connects with the Starlink internet satellites as they sail overhead. So consumers, users of the Starlink network, when they sign up for the service, will receive this antenna from SpaceX as well as a modem. And then they basically just point it at the sky. As the Starlink satellites go overhead, they will transmit and receive broadband signals between the user on the ground and the satellites in orbit. In the next minute or so, the loading of kerosene fuel onto the second stage should be concluding, and that'll be followed pretty rapidly by the so-called big vent from the strongback. That's a gaseous oxygen purge associated with chill down of the liquid oxygen line that runs up the strongback structure. That's the arm next to the Falcon 9 rocket, the vertical structure next to the rocket. That chill down or thermal conditioning will begin in about 30 seconds or so, and that's a precursor to the start of loading of liquid oxygen onto the second stage at T-minus 16 minutes. And there is the vent from the strongback, the big vent, which for Falcon 9 countdowns always occurs at about T-minus 20 minutes. A good sign that propellant loading is proceeding normally this morning.
Stage 2, everyone load complete.
And if you're just joining us and you haven't done so yet, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. If you hit the thumbs up or the like button, we really appreciate that because that gets more people tuned in to our launch coverage. Less than 20 minutes now until liftoff. This vent from the strongback will continue for about 2 minutes more. 2 minutes to go in this vent, and then the vent will terminate, and at that point loading of liquid oxygen can begin onto the second stage. With the calm winds here on Florida Space Coast this morning, that vent is not being blown very far. Those gaseous oxygen vapors are staying around the vehicle with the calm winds here at the Kennedy Space Center. The weather conditions continue to look very favorable for liftoff this morning at 2:58 a.m. Eastern Time. Minutes, 16 minutes, 30 seconds. We're going to stand by. There's the end of the vent. I was just about to say we're going to stand by for that, but we just saw the end of the vent from the Strongback, and that allows the loading of liquid oxygen onto the second stage to begin. And we just heard the call. I apologize for talking over it. The call from SpaceX Launch Control confirming the start of liquid oxygen load on the second stage. This is the last of the 4 propellant tanks to be loaded this morning. In parallel, at the same time as the kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants are being loaded onto the vehicle, high pressure helium is also flowing into tanks called COPVs, composite overwrapped pressure vessels, on both stages of the Falcon 9 rocket. This helium will be used to be injected into the propellant tanks during the flight to maintain pressure inside those tanks as the propellants are consumed. So propellant and pressurant both being loaded into the Falcon 9, 15 minutes, 20 seconds to go. Here's a look at the countdown timeline. We've already passed the first few milestones in this countdown timeline. We saw propellant load begin at T-minus 35 minutes, and then just about a minute and a half ago, we heard the call of liquid oxygen loading onto the second stage of the Falcon 9 rocket, so we've passed that milestone now. Looking ahead at T-minus 7 minutes, that'll be the time at which the 9 Merlin first stage engines on the Falcon 9 rocket will begin to be thermally conditioned for flight. That will involve flowing a little bit of super cold liquid oxygen through some of the engine plumbing to condition those components for ignition. At T-minus 5.5 minutes, the Falcon 9 rocket should be fully loaded with kerosene fuel. The first stage should be loaded with kerosene at that time. Second stage is already fully loaded with kerosene fuel. Also around that time, in the 5 to 6 minute time frame, SpaceX will confirm the readiness of the autonomous flight safety system. That's the destruct mechanism that would be used to destroy and terminate the flight in the event of a mishap or in the event that the Falcon 9 veers from its pre-approved flight corridor. At T-minus 4 minutes 30 seconds, the Strongback will begin retracting from the Falcon 9 rocket. And at T-minus 2 minutes, liquid oxygen loading will be complete. At that point, the Falcon 9 will be fully loaded for flight. And then at T-minus 60 seconds, the control of the countdown will be handed from the ground sequencer computer to the Falcon 9's onboard flight computer. We expect to hear a final go for launch from SpaceX's launch director in the final minute of the countdown. And then engine start. That command will be issued at T-minus 3 seconds. Computer systems on board the Falcon 9 will quickly do a health check of each of those engines to make sure they're all functioning properly. If everything looks good, the clearance will be given to open hold-down clamps at the base of the rocket to allow the Falcon 9 to begin its vertical climb to space this morning. This mission will be the sixth of the year, sixth space launch of the year from here at Kennedy Space Center or at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station just down the road. Here's a look at the trajectory, the changing slope of the launch cadence over the last 20 plus years. Last year there were 57 missions rather launched from Florida Space Coast. This will be number 6 of the year. At the beginning of the year, the Space Force, which runs the Eastern Range, projected 87 launches in 2023. 5 already in the books. 6 will be in the books in just 11 minutes or so. Two minutes, 10 minutes, 30 seconds, and counting. Everything continuing to look good for liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket at 2:58 a.m. Eastern Time, 2:58:20 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 7:58 a.m. UTC. Here's a look at the expected flight track this morning. The Falcon 9 rocket will depart Launch Complex 39A and head to the southeast out over the Atlantic Ocean. The red line on this map marks the approximate trajectory or track of the first stage booster. That first stage will burn about 2.5 minutes, then separate from the upper stage and continue arcing downrange, targeting a landing about 400 miles downrange on the SpaceX drone ship named a Shortfall of Gravitas. The green line here on this map shows the track of the upper stage. That upper stage will actually perform a slight right turn, as you can see on this map, using its thrust vector control system. That's called a dogleg maneuver, and this dogleg maneuver is necessary to ensure that the Falcon 9 does not fly over any of the populated islands of the Bahamas on its way to orbit. And then that upper stage will continue on a course to the southeast, northeast of the Bahamas, north of the Turks and Caicos Islands, and then just east of Puerto Rico before flying out over the Caribbean Sea and delivering these 53 Starlink satellites into orbit. It'll be about an hour-long mission this morning from the time of liftoff until the 53 Starlink satellites are deployed. Here's a quick look at the timeline. It's a standard profile, 2.5 minutes for the first stage burn. That first stage will be landing on the drone ship about 8 minutes and 44 seconds after liftoff, after performing its re-entry burn and then a final landing burn. The upper stage will take over the flight about 2.5 minutes into the mission with these 53 Starlink satellites. The payload fairing will jettison a few moments later, and then the upper stage will deliver the satellites to a parking orbit about 8.5 minutes after liftoff, and then there'll be a long coast before deployment of the Starlink satellites at T plus 64 minutes. The next major milestone in the countdown will be the start of engine chill down on the first stage. T-minus 6 minutes and counting. Engine chill down on the Falcon 9's Merlin main engines now underway. Again, this involves flowing a little bit of super cold liquid oxygen through those engines to condition them for ignition. Final checks of the range safety destruct system also underway at this point. Final checks of the Falcon 9's navigation system also underway. This is a fully automated countdown, so the computer sequencer is governing all of these events as the countdown ticks down. T-minus 5 minutes, 30 seconds now. This booster is booster 1069 in SpaceX's inventory of reusable rockets, going for its 5th flight this morning. It debuted back in December 2021 on a mission carrying a Dragon cargo capsule toward the International Space Station. This booster actually made a hard landing. It damaged some of its hardware, landing gear hardware. One of its landing legs crumpled a bit, and it was
pressing for strawberry retract.
And the booster returned to port on a tilt. It needed some repairs, so that explains the long gap between its first and second flights, December 2021 till August of 2022. And then since then, it's flown 2 more times with the Eutelsat Hotbird 13F TV broadcasting satellite, and then back on December the 8th, its most recent mission, it carried 40 Starlink satellites off the launch pad, or 40 OneWeb satellites.
Starlink lower has started.
Off the launch pad, rather. For the OneWeb Internet Network. Again, this booster 1069 going for its 5th flight to space this morning. The target orbit for this mission is a near circular orbit about 202 miles by 213 miles at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. Again, this is one of the new Starlink orbital shells for the 2nd generation or Gen 2 Starlink network. T-minus 3 minutes, 40 seconds. The strong back out at pad 39A is now lowering. This begins by the opening of clamps at the top of the strong back that wrap around the 2nd stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. Once those clamps are open, the strong back is able to recline to an angle of about 1.5 degrees. It's just a very slight retraction, 1.5 degrees away from the Falcon 9. And then at liftoff, we'll see that strong back swing away in a more rapid motion to allow the Falcon 9 to begin its climb to space. In the next minute or so, we also expect to hear the conclusion of the liquid oxygen loading on board the Falcon 9.
Stage 1 LOX load complete.
First stage liquid oxygen load is now complete. Second stage liquid oxygen load will continue for a few more seconds, actually down to about T-minus 2 minutes. That's when the Falcon 9 will be fully loaded with 1 million pounds of propellant. T-minus 2 minutes and counting. I'm going to hand off to my colleague Stephen Young now. He's going to provide the final countdown commentary for the next 2 minutes, and then he'll also talk you through the first couple of minutes of the flight of the Falcon 9 on the Starlink 5-3 mission.
Stage 2 LOX load complete.
The Falcon 9 is now fully loaded for the launch this morning.
Ground gas closeouts has started.
Seeing some venting from the strong back structure as the Falcon 9 is prepared for flight this morning from historic Launchpad 39A. Now, within a minute to launch, the Falcon 9 will be in startup. The flight termination system is being activated.
LD, go for launch.
There's the final go for launch from the launch director. T-minus 20 seconds. The Falcon 9's 9 Merlin engines will begin their ignition sequence at T-minus 3 seconds. Three, two, one, engine ignition, and liftoff. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 carrying another batch of Starlink satellites. The vehicle has cleared the tower, now starting its pitch downrange. Now starting to hear the rumble of those Merlin engines. SpaceX reporting everything going nominal with today's launch.
Falcon 9 is supersonic.
We've just passed through the period of maximum dynamic stress on the vehicle. See the contrails as those as the rocket carves its way through the atmosphere this morning. Starting to see some color in the plume. The rocket continues its journey downrange. Already reaching an altitude of 35 kilometers. The next major event will be separation of the payload fairing. Now switching to views from SpaceX. These views come with a little bit of a delay, about 10 seconds today.
Stage separation confirmed.
We have confirmation of stage separation.
And back ignition.
Ignition of the second stage MVAC engine. Now view
Fairing
inside the
separation
payload
confirmed.
fairing. There's the payload fairing separation. On the left side of your screen, you're seeing views from the first stage, grid fins extending. On the right side, the red hot glow of that second stage engine. Is a view of the live telemetry coming from SpaceX, which shows us the path of the Falcon 9 upper stage as it heads to orbit, and the Falcon 9 first stage as it heads towards a landing on a drone ship in the Atlantic. The blue line indicates the impact line should something occur with the burn of this engine, that is the path the vehicle would take should a malfunction occur. You see the ground track there taking us to the north of the Bahamas.
Acquisition and signal, Bermuda.
SpaceX is now receiving telemetry via the Bermuda tracking station.
T+5 minutes now into the flight of the Starlink 5-3
Both
mission.
vehicles on a nominal trajectory.
I'm Stephen Clark again, resuming commentary. Thank you to Stephen Young for handling the final countdown in the first few minutes of the flight. See, this map shows the locations of Stage 1 and Stage 2. Stage 1 arcing toward the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas about 400 miles, a little more, over 600 kilometers downrange from the Cape. Stage 2 accelerating into orbit now with its single Merlin vacuum engine firing to propel these 53 Starlink satellites into orbit. Good view of that Merlin vacuum engine firing here. Nozzle glowing red hot, as is normal, producing more than 200,000 pounds of thrust, guzzling that kerosene and liquid oxygen that were loaded into the vehicle that we talked about a lot during the countdown. That propellant now being consumed by the Merlin vacuum engine. The next few moments, we expect to see
Stage 2 FTS is safe.
we expect to hear and see confirmation of the entry burn of the first stage booster. This will involve igniting three of its 9 engines, for a braking maneuver to begin slowing down during re-entry, heading for the drone ship landing.
Stage 1 FTS is safe.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
We've heard, and now we see confirmation of the entry burn underway. This entry burn using the thrust of 3 of the 9 Merlin engines. You can see the velocity now decreasing on the first stage booster in the lower left, just passing below 6,500 kilometers per hour. Meanwhile, on the lower right,
Stage
the
1 entry burn shutdown.
speedometer for the upper stage continues increasing as it powers into orbit. The entry burn is now complete. The next milestone will be the beginning of the landing burn about a minute from now.
Both vehicles continuing on a nominal trajectory.
Stage 1 transonic.
Heard the call that the first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket is now passing below the speed of sound through the transonic regime. We'll stand by for the start of the landing burn in the next few moments. That will be the ignition of the center engine, one engine, for the final maneuver before touchdown.
Terminal guidance.
And the landing burn is
Stage
underway.
1 landing burn.
On the left-hand side of your screen, you can see an onboard camera view. The drone ship will be soon coming into view.
Stage 1 landing leg deploy. CH1 landing confirmed.
Fantastic video this morning. Landing confirmed. Booster 1069 is on the deck of the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas, 9
Nominal orbit
minutes
insertion.
after lifting off from Kennedy Space Center. Meanwhile, we just heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that there was a nominal orbital insertion on the upper stage. So the upper stage engine has completed its engine firing to place the 53 Starlink satellites into a preliminary parking orbit. A great start to this mission, Starlink 5-3.
Expected loss of signal, Cape Canaveral.
And the Falcon 9 upper stage is now passed over the horizon from Cape Canaveral. So the ground station here at the launch site has lost the signal from the rocket as expected. But downrange tracking stations will continue tracking and receiving telemetry from the rocket from the upper stage throughout the remainder of its flight. It'll take another 54 minutes before the Falcon 9 is ready to deploy the 53 Starlink satellites into orbit.
Expected loss of signal, Bermuda.
Now 15 minutes 38 seconds since the successful liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket from here at Kennedy Space Center, Florida, to begin the Starlink 5-3 mission carrying 53 Starlink internet satellites into orbit. We saw a successful climb out of the Falcon 9 from Launch Complex 39A, a successful staging of the first and second stages of the Falcon 9. The first stage made its way to a successful landing on the drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas, one of 3 SpaceX drone ships used for rocket landings and recoveries. So that booster 1069, has completed its 5th flight to space this morning. Stage 2 of the Falcon 9 accelerated into orbit with its single engine, and the Falcon 9 upper stage with the 53 Starlink satellites are now in a parking orbit flying just off the coast of Brazil, soon to pass over the very easternmost part of Brazil and then making a swing over the southern Atlantic Ocean. The deployment of the 53 Starlink satellites is not scheduled until T+64 minutes, so that's still more than 45 minutes away until the separation of these 53 Starlink satellites. So we're going to wrap up our live commentary on our dedicated stream. We'll continue to have periodic updates throughout the mission, and we'll confirm the deployment of the 53 Starlink satellites on our dedicated Launchpad live stream on YouTube over the next 45 minutes to hour or so. Before we leave you, though, we want to review some of the statistics for this mission. This was the 201st flight of a Falcon 9 rocket since 2010, the 211th launch overall of SpaceX's Falcon rocket family. This was the 5th flight of this particular Falcon 9 booster, Booster 1069. This was the 172nd Falcon 9 launch from Florida, the 61st SpaceX launch from Launch Complex 39A, which of course has a long and storied history dating back to the Apollo program, the 155th launch overall from Pad 39A. This includes Saturn V rockets from the Apollo program, numerous space shuttles, and these 61 SpaceX missions that have all occurred since 2017. This was the 142nd Falcon 9 launch to utilize a reused booster. This marked the 169th successful landing of a Falcon booster, including Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy missions. This was the 71st SpaceX launch, primarily dedicated with a primary purpose of deploying Starlink internet satellites. This was the 8th SpaceX launch of this year and the 6th of the year from here at Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center. And before we leave you this morning, we want to look ahead at some of the launches on our calendar over the next couple of weeks. The next launch from here on Florida Space Coast will be on Sunday evening. This will be a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket departing from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, carrying the Amazonas Nexus broadband satellite. This is a geostationary high-throughput satellite for the Spanish company Hispasat. The launch window opens around 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 22:30 UTC on Sunday, February the 5th. Also on Sunday, Russia's first launch of the year is scheduled from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. This will be a Proton rocket carrying a Russian weather satellite into orbit. The Electro-L number 4 weather satellite will be heading up to geostationary orbit on a Proton rocket. Later this month, on February the 9th, another Russian launch from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, a Soyuz rocket, will be launching a Progress resupply craft to the International Space Station. This Progress MS-22 spacecraft will be carrying food, water, air, and other supplies to the International Space Station. And then on February the 11th, the next Starlink mission is scheduled to launch from here at Cape Canaveral, again from Pad 40 down at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This will be another Falcon 9 rocket carrying another batch of 50 or a little more than 50 Starlink internet satellites to orbit, a very similar mission to the one we're covering this morning. We'll leave you with one final look from our position here at the Kennedy Space Center, looking out toward the empty pad at Launch Complex 39A, where the Falcon 9 rocket lifted off 22 minutes ago at 2:58 a.m. Eastern Time, 7:58 a.m. UTC. We'll be back again Sunday for the coverage of the next SpaceX mission from Pad 40 here at Cape Canaveral. We'll be streaming that live here on our YouTube channel. Also, again, just a reminder, I'll be providing some additional updates throughout the rest of the mission, as well as a confirmation of the deployment of the Starlink satellites over on our Launchpad Live channel, or Launchpad live stream here on our YouTube channel. So until next time, I'm Stephen Clark reporting live from Kennedy Space Center. I want to thank Stephen Young for video production and commentary support this morning. We'll see you this weekend for the next Falcon 9 launch.